That's the only time one ever brings.
Okay, the Historical Society is very pleased tonight to welcome Ken Gloss, the proprietor of internationally known Brattle Bookshop in Boston's Downtown Crossing. He's a frequent guest, and I know we've seen him on PBS Antiques Roadshow, and he was going to talk a little bit about his historic bookshop, which goes back to about 1825, and he's a second-generation owner, and about the enjoyment of hunting for books and some of the wonderful stories that he has to tell us about his quest for this. And I'm not going to take any more of your time because we want Ken to have the floor.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'll mention that I've started doing a podcast, and that's all down here. My cards and the information are there and outside. But listen to the podcast because we're trying to get people to listen. What I do in a talk is the talk will last about 45 minutes to an hour. The first half hour I'll talk about what is an old book, first editions. I'll show off some of the things that I've brought. I have give a little bit of the history background of myself, the store, and tell some stories, anecdotes of places I've been, people I've seen, and whatever else. And then what I like to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is question and answer. Because I can go on and on and on and on about old books. And at least with question and answer, I can go on about what you want to listen to. The last minute or two of the talk, I will appraise one or two books from the audience to the whole audience in detail. After that, I'll end the formal part of the talk, so anyone who wants to go can go. But I'll stay, I'll answer any and all questions, and I'll do any and all appraisals. I'll just do them a lot more quickly so we can get out of here tonight. I guess the first thing that comes up when you talk about old books is what is an old book? And usually people mean by that what's a valuable old book. Well, the first printed book was in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. If any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you that it's valuable. Matter of fact, the last time one sold, half of it sold for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000 on average, and some even more. But any book printed in the 1400s has value. Some more than others, but anything in the 1400s. After that, it depends on what the book is. You can have a book printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and uninteresting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and an interesting book now, and nobody cares or will pay very much for it. On the other hand, you can have a relatively recent book. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book in London has sold up to $80,000. So it's all a matter of what people are looking for. And I get loads of calls at the store, and people say, I have an old book, and I know it's an old book, and the way I know it's old is the pages are all brown and crumbling. Well, I point out that's more lousy paper than it is how old the book is. Now, this is a page from a book, and I'll pass this around. Some of the things I show off are small. I know they are. They'll be up here at the end, but they won't be passed. But you'll passed around. But you'll see that this isn't terribly fragile. The paper's white. The ink's black. This is one of the first books done with illustrations. It was printed in the 1490s. So this page is a little over 500 years old. And you sort of say to yourself, well, gee, if they could make books like that then, why don't they do it now? Well, there was a big disadvantage to a book like that. First of all, in the 1490s, you had to be quite wealthy to get an education, to learn how to read. You had to be almost nobility to be able to afford to buy a book like that. Nowadays, maybe the books aren't quite as well made, but they're at a price that can be distributed in the millions. And the real value of books is the knowledge in the books and the dissemination of that knowledge, and I think it's a very good trade-off. Whenever you talk about book collecting, someone will come up and say, I have a first edition. How much is it worth? And I point out that most first editions never came out in a second edition, probably never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody wants them, cares about them, or would pay anything whatsoever. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there are a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature. Dickens, Twain, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and so on. And even within that, there are a lot of things that make a big difference in the price. The condition being one of the most important. The paper dust jacket on a 20th century book can make all the difference in the world. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes. Absolutely pristine, as if someone took it from the publisher, sealed it away. At the time my father got it, he sold it within a week for $750. At the exact same time, another book dealer in the Boston area had the same book, Mosquitoes, Faulkner, first edition, but it didn't have the paper jacket on it, and it had a few tiny little nicks and bumps, nothing terrible. It took them a year to sell it at $40. Because a lot of collecting is prestige. It's maybe to say, look what I have. I have the best. I have the most wonderful. Essentially, I have what you don't have, and people who can afford it will pay the absolute top price for the very, very best, but might not consider spending anything at all for something even slightly less. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, again, if the author's unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed might not mean much. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. It might mean an awful lot to your family, but it doesn't necessarily add much to the price. On the other hand, if it's signed by someone famous, maybe Ernest Hemingway, that could add hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to the value. In almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances that can add or subtract to the value, and I use signed books to show that off a little. There are some authors that are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, for instance, who wrote Catcher in the Rye, lived up in New Hampshire. He was reclusive. He didn't appear in public, essentially didn't publish anymore, and other than to a close personal friend, absolutely would not sign a book. Thus, his signature adds thousands of dollars to the value because you just can't get them. And this is a little aside. Sometimes people ask me, is there something that came into the store that you saw that for whatever reason you didn't get to buy or whatever? There was a man came in a number of years ago and he was a friend of J.D. Salinger's. And he had a whole group of letters from him. And they were nice letters, but there was one letter in particular that I particularly liked. J.D. Salinger was looking back and when he first moved to New Hampshire and they built his house. And he was talking about when they did the foundation, a bunch of high school kids in the area helped work on the foundation. And then he said, and one of those high school kids, he was a pretty good athlete, that kid, Carlton Fisk. So Carlton Fisk helped build J.D. Salinger's house. I actually think that letter belongs in the Baseball Hall of Fame. But in any case, and then there are other authors who, and maybe someday that man will come back and I'll get to buy the letter. There are some authors who sign a little bit more. There was a local author, maybe some of you have his books or knew him. He wrote wonderful ghost, sea, buried treasure, pirate stories of the New England coast. His name was Edward Rose Snow. Now, Snow was a friend of my father's and I knew him. And I remember one day he came into the store and he told us he had just been on Cape Cod and he had gone into a bookstore that he had never been in before. And Snow said, went right up to the section where his books were, pulled one off the shelf, opened it up, and exclaimed, "My, a rare, unsigned copy." And then he took out a pen and signed it, and then he introduced himself to the owner of the store. So books signed by Edward Rose Snow don't add that much to the value. My father had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. Now, just opposite what I was saying before, it was a first edition. It didn't have a dust jacket. It was actually very well worn and read. But when you open it up on the front, it was inscribed to the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, in addition to that inscription, when T.S. Eliot read the book, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, crossed things out, added things in to just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $200,000, $300,000, maybe even $400,000 because of the association. One last story on autographs and signed books. There was an autograph and manuscript dealer in Massachusetts. He was actually one of the most prominent in the world. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Robert Frost, and he knew Robert Frost. And when he was 13 years old, he went to London, and he bought a copy of Frost's first book called A Boy's Will. Very complicated, what really is the first edition. Paid a lot of money for it, came back to Boston, and a few weeks later he met with Frost. He was very proud of himself. He said, look what I've got. And Frost looked at it and said, what did you pay for it? And he told him, and Frost said, give me the book. And Frost took it, and in the front two end papers wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second binding, from the third binding, from the fourth binding, how they changed bindings, why they changed bindings, the different colors of the bindings. On and on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy and said, now it's worth what you paid for us. In any case, let me digress a little, give you a little bit of my background and the history of the store. The history of the Brattle Bookshop does go back to the 1820s, but for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married, my mother had $500. With that, they bought half interest in the store. And my father built the business with his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge, and he was a bit of a character and a showman. And it's always been in Boston. We get loads of calls, people are in Harvard Square on Brattle Street, where are you? We tell them we're downtown. When my parents first bought the store, there was a little side street in what was Scully Square called Brattle Street. And to make it even more confusing, the street doesn't even exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is. And we've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. And every time we'd move, when it was planned, my father would move the best books over to the new location, and then he'd run sales. Half-price $1, 50-cent, quarter, dime. Last day of the sale, though, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever, ring a big bell, they'd go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, my father would ring the bell again, they'd leave, the next group would come in, and he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969. We were moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street, where we are now, and at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over, and like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. If you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team, and on the cover of the covered wagon it said, "Go West, book lovers, go 5 West Street, Brattle Bookshop." They filled it up with books, and they drove it from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common to where West Street is, and then back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic was a friend of his, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He'd gotten his point across. And we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building absolutely crammed full of books. In February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. Building was on fire, and it literally burned to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to continue to not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. We rented folding tables. People either sold, gave us, or donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And even though it was a meager stock, within a month we reopened. The main thing was just keep going. And over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is, again, a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1, 3 and 5, 2 floors of general used books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, first editions, leather bindings, and so on. And that type of business, the large, old, general, secondhand bookstore, especially in the inner cities, is a dying business. And it's not dying because people don't like books, buy books, read books, sell books, but particularly in the last 20, 25 years, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which I assure you are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world, one right after the other, especially in the cities, have been going out of business. Now, like I say, we bought our building 30 years ago, so I hope to be doing this for years to come. I have daughters who are in their early 30s. I don't think they have any intention whatsoever of coming into the business the way I did. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I really don't know, but I'm sure they were talking about them all the time. And then I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year now has been over 40 years. And I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. Now, if you would ask me what's one item that I would love to find, and I know these are small, but it's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian. It was done in 1827, and it doesn't look like very much, but the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's his first book. It's a classic rarity in American literature. Matter of fact, the first copy to ever really be found was in the 1890s on a dealer's 10-cent table. Another dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out, and in 1890 sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were two postmen in the New Bedford area who on the side were book scouts, and being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were, bought a trunk of books, bottom of the trunk, Tamerlane. Families got involved, they got to negotiating, and 6 months later, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again, but they did get their $10,000. And then about 15 years ago, or 20, an antique dealer in the Newburyport area died. His whole estate was auctioned. Furniture, antiques, paintings, books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each. Of course, someone picked out a Tamerlane. About 15 years ago, sold it for $198,000. And about 3 or 4 years ago, a copy sold for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I bring with me are originals. I don't bring million-dollar pamphlets. But if any of you want to take a close look and then go home, check your attic, cellars, basements, whatever. If you find one, please give me a call. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying it, is appreciating it. It's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Someone might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really that knowledge and understanding that makes things important and valuable. Now, here's an item that on the surface I think is interesting, but the story behind it may be even more so. This is on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's a most important post, etc., signed always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt. And it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, on the surface, this seems like a great honor. It's an ambassadorial appointment. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which, of course, he probably was. And remember, this was 1933, and Curley's response was, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's opinion of Washington didn't change over the years. We also have about 10 letters he wrote to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these are personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into prison, and he wrote to his wife, and he said, many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington. In any case, enough for Curley. We get a lot of things in, not all of them are books, but we get brochures, letters, documents, programs. Here's a program from the 1912 World Series, where the Red Sox played the Giants. The Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, a few more times in the teens, and then we had to wait a long, long time. And they started off well this year. We'll see what happens. And not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back, there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are 2 for $1, shirts are $1.50 and $2. I don't know that you'll get them for that nowadays. It's also become very, very popular to go on cruises, cruise ships. I have a brochure for a ship here. It tells you how wonderfully built, where to book passage, and anyone who wants to go on the Titanic. This is a brochure. But there almost anything that you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. There's also a tendency that whenever you talk about collectibles, I mean, I do books and autographs and manuscripts, but all of a sudden everything seems to be worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And I like to point out not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance, here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover, another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And the large majority of these sell for a few dollars. There are lots of them. There are a few exceptions, but the large majority are very cheap. We used to have a wall by one of our stairways with a few hundred of these more famous lives hanging, and people would stop and stare at that wall, sometimes a half an hour, even an hour at a time, lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the covers, the stories, the articles, the photographs. They made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell in the right dates. And then we had a regular customer come in, and he bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II, and it wasn't what he normally bought. So I said to him, "Why are you buying these?" And he said, "Well, I want to teach my children about World War II." And he thought a nice way to do it would be to get a few of the Lives, look at photos, read an article or so, and then discuss it with them. Sounded like a good idea to me, but I was a little skeptical. He came in about 2 weeks later, and I said to him, "How's it going with the Lives?" He said, "Fabulously," but not the way I thought. He says, "The kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads." And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they had done everything else anyways. I have a cookbook from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. And then you have How to Bake Eels the Common Way. I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but that's beside the point. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island every day, never knowing what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters, the books, obviously. And I'll relate a few of those stories to you. And then after that, maybe some questions. This was a while ago. I was out of the store. I got back. There was a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called, and she had some books. I called her up, and she said, "Oh, yes, my father died in Providence. He has 500 art reference books. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested?" Well, 500 art reference books sounds pretty good. Providence is only an hour away. More than happy to go down. They lived on an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. I got to the house. It was a large old colonial house, got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought about 80% of the books I wanted. I was happy. She was pleased. And she said, "My mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction. But would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there?" Well, their house in Newport is one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this day. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those mansions that was still being lived in by a family, and at one point wandering from the basement to the attic all on my own without a tour guide saying, "Come here, go here, don't touch this," and so on, but literally just wandering through the place. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, when I come to groups like this, I do hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me and the Brattle Bookshop. I don't care if you think of 10 others, just as long as I'm one of the 10. And we have our cards here, and we have the podcast, and we have all of that. But there are times, And I do that by giving out as much free information as reasonably possible. But there are times when people need very formal written appraisals for insurance, estate taxes, or whatever reason. Then I discuss a fee. In any case, I went to another mansion in Newport, not quite as big as the Browns, but this was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry. And what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But it was a day-to-day accountings of the ships, and they were fascinating to read through. They would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, "Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg." And that was the last you heard of the captain. So again, that's a little different. When my father was still alive, and he died over 30 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but it sounded like she might have a few interesting things. She lived in Sharon, so it was fairly close. We decided to go to a house. We got to the house. It was a little ranch house. Paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say to yourself, oh, gee, what's going to be here? She answered the door. She was quite elderly. We walked in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. Well, it turned out she got to talking. She was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution, and she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe and all the court intrigues and all the goings-on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into the house, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors. They were about so big. They were pastoral European scenes. And when I first saw them, I thought they were nice. And the more she talked and the longer we were there and the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice. And she sort of turned around and said, oh, yes, they're all Turners. So she had 10 original Turner, probably $1 million worth of painting. And it was like, oh, yeah, they're all Turners, you know. So you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. As a matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 20 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to speak in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go? And he said, well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo is a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who can tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. And obviously he was a much younger man then. He was looking forward to this dinner and all the learning and insight he was going to get from these two men. He said he was excited, so he got there a little bit early. 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was quite elderly, he had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite. And he said the first thing, Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. Now, I can go on and on and on with these stories. I'll tell one more, and then we'll see about questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store. People wanting to know, do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or what's the value? What's the price? And most of those questions, either I or the people I work with, we can answer right off the top of our heads. Some are a little more involved, and occasionally you really have to do some research. That can be fun too. But every once in a while, you get a call that really stands out. And again, this was quite a while ago, but I answered the phone, "Hello, Brattle Bookshop, can I help you?" Lady, elderly, thick Irish brogue. And the first thing she says is, President Kennedy slept with me. Well, you have to admit it gets your attention. And she stopped and waited for it to sink in. And then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family. She had been his nursemaid. When he was 3 and 4 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Now, presidential letters of any type have value. Handwritten letters from later 20th century presidents are particularly hard to get, scarce and rare, worth a lot of money. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was a little skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet. I went to her house. She had great stories. It was a lot of fun. The letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer, but much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. The letters were part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong. Again, maybe someday I'll get a call. Who knows? Like I say, I can go on and on and on, but why don't I see if there are some questions, because quite honestly, anything you ask me, I can go off on a tangent. But does anyone have any questions? No? Yes? Yes.
You say you had the Brattle Street bookstore, right?
Yes, Brattle Bookshop.
Brattle Bookstore. I bought a book and I have it with me, an old antique book, and I remember there was a number of stories. It's 1962. I came as a student, and then we went to Hall again, and I came back here. But it was down in the cellar. You had the antiquariat or something.
It depends on which store, because we've had 7, but yes, my father, like I said, took it over in the 40s, but there's also a bookstore that was down in the cellar, Goodspeed's, which was our competitor, and that, one or the other, but they're both very good stores. Unfortunately, they went out of business about 20-something years ago. Yeah, and we get a lot of, I mean, Boston is a town where there are huge numbers of schools and students, and so you never know what you're going to have. And I remember there was, when I first came to the store, there was a man who would come in, and I got to know him. He was a vice president of a bank in North Carolina, but he had gone to school in Boston and bought books for my father. And he realized I get into work very early in the morning. First of all, there's less traffic. Also, I'm an early person, and I can get a lot done in the morning. And he used to know that. And he said, used to call up from North Carolina, said, I'm going to New York, but I can take an early shuttle, get to Boston. Is it all right if I come in? And that's fine. And a very nice man. And he was a vice president, then he was a senior vice president, executive vice president. Then his banks merged, and then he was president of Bank of America. And he would still call me up and say, can I come in early in the morning? And I, it's the president of Bank of America. I figured, he had good credit, so what the heck. But he was a very, very nice man. And so you never know who that student who comes in when they're in school might be 20, 30 years from now. And that does happen, yes.
I have a question. How interesting or important or whatever are illustrations in a book? The book itself is interesting but not great, but the illustrations are beautiful engravings and such.
Well, the question is, how interesting are illustrations in a book? And almost any general question you ask me, I can give a general answer, and it depends. And that's basically the answer. I mean, obviously, if you have Audubons and they're big and huge, those are illustrations. If you have N.C. Wyeth, Arthur Rackham, Kate Greenaway, those are illustrations. If you have books that were done in the 60s of Chagall, where they had original lithographs, and those are illustrations. And then there are loads and loads of books in the 19th century that have sort of dark religious things, and people could care less about them. So it all depends on what the book is, who the illustrator is, the condition, and in some cases the illustrations are what make the book valuable. In other cases, it's the author. In other cases, it's the binder, it's the paper, it's the designer. And in most cases, nothing makes the book valuable because it's just a book and it's a used book. So each one is individual. There's no flat answer to that. Yes, so.
Preservation. If you had a book that's either sentimental or even worth something, how do you suggest preservation?
Well, the question is preserving or taking care of the books. And usually what I say to people, and I'm assuming you're not having a collection that you're going to build an atmospherically controlled room with all sorts of, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I'm going to assume that generally, if you're comfortable, the books will be comfortable. If it's not too hot, too cold, too damp, too dry, a lot of these books are old. They've lasted longer than we have, and they'll probably last a whole lot longer than we will. Other things, you might want to keep them out of direct sunlight. Because a lot of times you'll see books that are green, but they have a brown spine. They didn't make them two-toned. They just faded. So keep them out of sunlight. Also, don't put them in a shelf too tight, because inevitably somebody will do this and tear it. Or too loose, because they'll do that. So in general, if you don't harm the books, do something to hurt them, they'll last a pretty good long time. Now, if you do have a book that's in poorer condition, there are two ways and two reasons to do repair work. One is financial, and the other is sentimental. If it's financial, it's very expensive to properly go to a bookbinder, paper restorer, and so on. So if you have a $5 book and you put a $500 repair in it, you're still going to have a $5 book when you finish. So, but if you have a $5,000 or $10,000 book, putting a few $100s might make sense. Usually what I suggest to people is do the least you possibly can. If you have a Tamerlane and it's fragile, don't do anything to the binding. Maybe have a box made for it, and that way you can have a beautiful, beautiful leather binding, and then you open the box and the original's in it. But usually the less you can, and if you do anything, you want someone who really knows how to do it, that if something in the future says, well, you shouldn't have done it, like, you can reverse it. And then, of course, the other reason for repairing is if you, let's say, got a book that's been generation after generation in your family, well, then what you pay for it is purely sentimental, not necessarily financial, and you make your own decisions. In the back.
How much has the internet changed where you sell books to or get them from?
Well,
more international now?
Well, the question is, how has the internet affected things? And it's affected things tremendously. And I'm not going to go on for an hour and a half, but I'll tell a few basic things. There are a lot of books that 25, 30 years ago were, quote, rare. They were hard to find, hard to get. If you went into a bookstore and you saw it there, it might be more than you want, but you know that 2 years from now you might want that book, you'd pay that price because when you wanted it, you know, the picture of the old professor or scholar, male or female, sitting in their library with books all around them was so that you could reach up and, oh, when was the Battle of Waterloo? You know, when did Einstein do this? Well, now you just go Google when, you know, or now you can even talk to the devices and do it. So anything that was a book that was pure information, nobody buys an encyclopedia, nobody buys dictionaries, but it's even a very frustrating type of book for me is walking into somebody and they might have a wall of art books that they spent hundreds of dollars on. Well, they spent it for the most part because they wanted access to be able to see all those pictures. You don't need those books anymore. So that wall that used to be worth hundreds of dollars even a piece, now sometimes they're just $1 or $2 because any book that you bought just for reference, just for information, not because you're collecting or the value has just come way down. And also, the other thing that happens a little is where I said you'd go into the bookstore and you'd buy it because you know you'd need it. Now that you find out, you go click, click, 100 copies come up. First of all, that's price competition, so it tends, you don't, you know, people tell me, well, look, it was this to this, so I figured the middle. And I say, well, gee, if I was buying a copy of it, I wouldn't buy in the middle. If it's a good copy, I'd buy the cheapest one. So there are 3 ways to sell books on the internet. Either to have the only copy, the best copy, or the cheapest. So that's, and it has brought prices for the most part. Also, if let's say you're that scholar, and you go click, click, and you find 30 copies, you say, well, I'll buy it when I need it. Which means you probably never buy it, because you probably in most cases never needed. So that's cut that way down. And as far as selling through the internet, and I get this a lot, first of all, the internet is a tool. And if you know how to use the tool very, very well, it's like any tool. You know, it works. You know, a cabinet maker has their tools, and they can make beautiful cabinets. Give me that, and I probably will smash my thumb with the hammer, and I don't know, you know, I'm not good at using those tools. The internet is unedited. So you can have a book that's like $10 and $10,000, and it looks like the same book. And quite honestly, it might be, because the person putting it on. Also, nowadays, a lot of the pricing on the internet is done by computer. A lot of the big stores, what they do is everything's scanned in, and the computer every hour reprices things depending on how many are there. So you can get crazy prices, and it's pretty amazing what can happen. But if you're selling your own library, in most cases, if you went on the internet to sell it, you probably could get more than a dealer will give you, in most cases, not all. But if you have 1,000 books, that might be a year's worth of work. I mean, and how much you pay yourself, you might end up paying yourself 10 cents an hour to get that extra money. You know, if that's what you want to do and you enjoy it and it's fun, that's one thing. If you're moving in 2 weeks, it might be a difficult. So there's pluses and minuses, and it gives out information, and things that give out information overall is probably a good thing. I have a daughter who lives in Africa, and the fact that the internet, the people there can access all the libraries and the knowledge of the world quickly, cheaply, and easily, for society is fabulous. Might not be the best thing for a used bookstore, but overall, it's fabulous, and it's not going to change back. So, you know, you just. You had a question.
I assume you have genealogy books. What kind of collection do you have there for sale?
Well, the question is genealogy books. Actually, that falls exactly into the type of book I was just talking. There are only two reasons that people buy genealogies. One is your family, and it's sort of a landmark thing that you want because it's your genealogy. Probably the 80% of the people who buy genealogies or even town histories want them for the information. All of that information, or large portions, have been digitized, and those books have gone from here to almost unsaleable in many cases. I just this morning was pricing some family genealogies that I would have priced $200, $300, $400 20 years ago. I put outside on our $5 sale tables because they just don't need them, other than if you find that one family. And they've just been steadily going down, and they're not going back up, other than the beautifully leather-bound, or somebody might buy a history of STOW. Let's say someone just moved into the town, and you want to give them a housewarming present. Well, you might give them a nice copy of the history of the town, maybe a map of the town, but all of the people who wanted it just because they want the information, the minute that's digitized in the records of the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Stowe Historical, and slowly but surely, it's really just killed the value of them. So we don't do as much of that anymore, but there are a few dealers around the country that if you're looking, we recommend, and so on, and some of it ends up on the internet, but it's, again, you...
Like Heritage?
What?
That's Diamond doesn't.
What about
Heritage?
Magazine.
Heritage Magazine?
Yeah.
That you can't, they're almost unsaleable. There are so many.
It's a bookstore.
Oh, Heritage in California. There's a Heritage bookstore in California. They deal in only very, very high, rare books, and genealogies definitely wouldn't fit into their categories. There's an auction gallery in Dallas, Texas, called Heritage Auctions that sells huge numbers, but more memorabilia, sports. They do have a book department, but they don't sell genealogy per se. But there's a wonderful historical and genealogical society on Newbury Street, and they'll go through it all. They have a library, but it just, the trending is down, not up, and I don't see it turning around. Tell you what, at this point, why don't I do one or two appraisals? Did anyone bring a Bible? If you want, I'll appraise that. And did anyone bring a Victorian book with a decorative cloth binding? The reason I'm asking for these has nothing to do with value. Yeah, sure, that will do. Has nothing to do with value. It has more that it leads to stories. No, that's fine. And quite honestly, on the decorative cloth, I brought one just in case you didn't, so I can still tell a story. I just needed one. It will serve the purpose. Let me first say something about appraising. When I come to a group like this, I give a retail value. In other words, that price that you would pay if you came into my store or a store like mine. It is not what you would get if you're selling the book. If you're selling the book, you should expect to get about 1/3 to 2/3 of the retail value. When you're dealing with the very low end, the markup might even be higher, just you have to make some money. And when you get to very expensive books, the percentages can change also. A number of years ago, I bought a copy of Audubon's Quadrupeds, not the birds, but the animals. But it was the big, huge, 150 plates. At the time, I paid $100,000 for it. I sold it within 2 weeks for $105,000. That's only a 5% markup, but it's $5,000. Well worth the time and effort I spent, and I pretty much had it pre-sold before I even bought it. So when you get to the much higher prices, especially on something that will turn over quickly, percentages can come down just because the amounts of money involved is so much more. Also, everything I say is subjective. In other words, I might say something's worth $100. A colleague of mine might say $125, and another colleague say $75. So if you know what you have, you get a price, you're happy, great. If you're not sure, get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just more a matter of how much time and effort you want to put into it. The first book we have here is by Augusta Evans. It's called St. Elmo. It's someone named Karen got it as a gift in 1985. It's a romance type novel, a turn of the century. It was printed in the 1800s. This one was a company called Gross and Dunlap was the publisher. They're a reprint company, so it's a reprint. It's $5 or $10. I mean, it looks like the sentiment of this is probably much more important as a gift. And I have people who sometimes they don't collect the book for the book, but they like looking and seeing what sentiments in the Victorian or early periods when someone gave it to someone else or what they had to say. One of the reasons I asked for a book, though, before they had dust jackets on books. Now, dust jackets go way back, but as we think of dust jackets, they were about World War I. But before that, a lot of books had very decorative covers, so that or that. And the reason they had decorative covers was the publishers figured if the book caught your eye when you walked in the store, more chance you might buy it. And this one was a lot more decorative when it came out. It's worn away a little. I'll give this back to you. But there are some people who collect the books just for the decorative covers. You can go to library sales, bookstores, thrift stores, auctions, and you can pick up a lot of books like this relatively cheaply. There are some that are expensive, and individually they might not seem like much, but graphically, as a collection, they can be quite interesting. As a matter of fact, I have a collection like that myself that started off as a bit of a joke. One day I got a book in, it had a picture of a toilet on the cover. Title of the book was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper. Invented the toilet. So I took it home, I showed it to my wife, she took one look at it and said, we have to put that in the bathroom. So we did. A couple of days later, we got another book, had a big eye staring out of the cover. And the title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. But with a big eye staring at you, I thought, put that in the bathroom too. Now, this is a little half bathroom, so there's no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, we built bookshelves, and now we have 300 or 400 of these Victorian-style illustrated books in our bathroom. People walk in, they're a little taken aback, but there's loads of reading material. And one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable, because every once in a while a book falls off the shelf, and you can imagine where it ends up. I like to finish the talk talking about Bibles. And one of the reasons I like to do that is the Bible is the most commonly printed book of all time, always has been, probably always will be. And we probably sometimes get 5 and 10 calls a week where people have 100, 200-year-old family Bibles. And in most cases, we have to say to them, if it's your family Bible, it's been handed down generation to generation to generation. Sentimentally, it's priceless. But monetarily, it doesn't have a lot of value. Now, is this one a family? Yeah. And it's been rebound. I mean, someone did a very nice job rebinding it. It's missing some pages, and those were repaired. Inside, there's a date of 1630 on the New Testament, which looks about right. I would have guessed somewhere in the 1600s. But the reality is, monetarily, it doesn't have a lot of value, but sentimentally, it might. And let me just give this one back to you, too. So, and we get, there's lots of Bibles, though. I mean, like I said, we get all those calls, and in almost all the cases, we have to say, that's what it is. When you get these big Victorian Bibles that have the beautiful glass, the embossed bindings, the beautiful gold tooling, most of those sell in the $100 to $300 range if they're in mint condition. They make wonderful gifts for ministers, priests, divinity students, but break one glass, have one hinge go, they lose all their value. Also, many times those old Bibles in the front, middle, or back, they have genealogies, they have family history. And usually the local historical or genealogical societies want that, but they want to just Xerox out that page, maybe the title page. They don't want the whole Bible. But I always tell people to check, because there are a lot of Bibles that are valuable. There's the Gutenberg Bible, and so on. So it's always worth checking, and no problem with that. And I'll end telling one last story. A number of years ago, I got called to do an appraisal at a church. Large, old church, well over 100 years old. And I spent a day there. They had a large library that they had just accumulated over the years, and they wanted to know, did they have any books that turned out to be valuable? And actually they did, and it was a nice library, had a lot of fun with it. At the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? We have a few more books. So I went down the basement and looked at the books, and then there was a closet. It was probably the size of one of those bathrooms. So it was a small room closet, sort of in the middle, and the priest opened the door, front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at it, and I said to the priest, what is this? He said, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? They come and they present it to the church. And he says, what do? We very graciously accept it. We don't want to offend anybody. Then we go downstairs, open the door, put it in with the rest of them. And he says, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That just wouldn't be right. So I use it as an example to say that if you want to give something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, great. But if all you're doing is you're really not doing anyone a favor. A couple of things. I do have my cards here. Don't ever feel that you're bothering me, the people I work with. We'd rather have 100 people call with nothing special than to have the 101st person say, I just threw away a Tamerlane. I do have the podcasts. We've got about 20 of them up now, and we're doing them every week. I think they're nice, and we're trying to get the listenership, but take the cards, don't that. And the way I do the appraisals at a group like this is I'll end the formal part of the talk, so anyone who wants to go, in the less order there is, the faster it goes. So people just sort of crowd up. If you want to stand over my shoulder and hear what I'm saying, that's fine, but I don't do it formally because I get to work at 5:36 in the morning. We'd be here until I had to go to work, just about. But if you want to, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to. But literally, I'll just say thank you very much, and then just bring things up, and I'll be happy to try to help. And literally, just come up. There's no,
This has our